Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar of 2021, A Practitioner's Perspective on DEI. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Project Strategist at the Diversity Movement. Over the past year, more organizations have committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives than ever before. And while intentions are good and aspirations are high, without the proper training and support for DEI practitioners, these initiatives can fall short of expectations. Today's webinar is hosted by the Diversity Movement's Head of Consulting, Dr. Florence Holland, who along with our esteemed panelists will discuss how DEI practitioners and those responsible for these initiatives can be successful. During this hour, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of them live as we can. If you're referencing this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag TDMwebinar and tag us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Before we dive in, I have a quick 2-question poll for you all that I'm going to go ahead and launch right now. All right, so the poll is up and I will await your responses. Perfect, I see some votes coming in. I'll give you all about a minute to respond. Perfect, so it looks like most people have responded. I'll give you all just a little longer. All right, so it looks like most of our votes are in, so I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and share the results. As you can see, we have quite a mix here. Thank you so much for participating. For those of you who are feeling under-equipped, settle into your seats and get ready to be empowered. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of sight and let our host take it from here. Florence, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Kayla. And so Kayla's gonna get our panelists set up so that they can join us via video as well. But in the meantime, I want to be sure that I welcome you to today, as Kayla said, we are excited that this is the first kickoff webinar for today, as we hope that the knowledge that, well, I don't hope, I know the knowledge that Dee and Dave are going to share is really going to help our practitioners really jump into 21, rearing and ready to go. I know a lot of people have created goals, have been reactionary in 2020, but have entered 21 with this kind of proactive mindset that they're trying to have for their organization. And you want to make sure that you're reared up and ready to go. And so I'm excited today. Just a quick note, obviously, with any time that we're talking conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we want to be sure that you allow yourself to, as we say, be comfortable being uncomfortable. So if it's a question you always had, but I don't think I should ask it here, ask it here. You're not on video. It's prime time to ask. It can be put in the chat and we will take our time to answer it because we definitely want you to get out of today what you wanted and why you joined this session, so that you can walk away feeling that you have gathered the knowledge, at least at a foundational level, that you need to go ahead and make this work impactful. So please get comfortable being uncomfortable, be vulnerable today, ask the questions that you want. You have, experts at your fingertips for free. So, and I know they charge you big bucks. They're not charging us. So use them today and get everything out of them that you can to make sure that you get your questions answered. So let's just jump right in. Every time we start a conversation, I always feel like we have so much time and then the time is going to pass and I'm going to go, we didn't have enough time. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves and then we're going to start with questions. So I will let Dee go first, just because she's in the bottom right. That's just how I pick, random pick. So she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, why we have selected her. You can see her awesomeness for to be one of our panelists today from a practitioner standpoint. Dave will go next, and then we'll start in questions. Obviously, like I said before, there is a chat feature. So even though I have some questions ready and rearing to go, please feel free to put questions in the chat feature so that we can make sure that your questions get answered as well. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Dee. Introduce yourself to those that we have here, and then Dave, you can go next.
All right, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, no matter where you are. I am Dee McDougal. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. I recently transitioned from banking into the world of consulting. So working for a firm that provides consulting services, management technology to consulting services to banks and insurance companies and energy companies. So, my career has mostly been in industries that have been focused around a particular demographic. And so I've always been and only in a lot of situations. And so my passion around DEI is something that is, both personal to me, but also really rooted in my desire to create the change that I'd like to see. So again, from Raleigh originally, and have had the opportunity to travel a good bit with the roles that I've held, but happy to be here, happy to answer any questions that everyone has about, just how do we actually do this work? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Happy to have you. Dave?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Laboy, and I am a DEI enthusiast. I am currently the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Spoonflower. And I'm actually almost 2 months in the role. Prior to that, I spent the bulk of my career at Blue Cross NC, holding different roles during my tenure there, but the last 8 I spent building our DEI practice, originally from Puerto Rico, but North Carolina has been home for the past 20 years, actually. So really excited to join the conversation this afternoon or morning or whatever time it is, wherever you're joining from, and excited to get started.
Absolutely. And I'll give just a brief introduction of myself because some of the questions can't hold my tongue and I'll have to say something. I am Florence Holland. As Kayla said, I am the head of consulting at the diversity movement. I have done diversity, equity, inclusion roles across a variety of industries. I was at a university in Auburn, Alabama, Auburn University. I led diversity and multicultural affair initiatives there. And then I transitioned to the other side of nonprofit space. And I did some work with the association world. I was the lead manager for pipeline initiatives, primarily related to underrepresented students for the Association of Certified Professional Accountants. And so did quite a few work around talent and talent acquisition and how to get students reared up for accounting firms all across our country. And then now have been at the diversity movement and helping multiple clients, again, just like Dee and Dave said, create a strategy and make sure that there's a strategic purpose to this. It absolutely is the right thing to do, but we need this institutionalized no matter who comes and goes. And so it has to be strategic. And so that's what we do in our everyday. So that's me. And so I will add commentary when needed. But other than that, I'm just going to ask questions. And like I said, feel free to post some questions in the chat. So the very first question that I have, because we probably will have some people online that they're in this work doing it already, and then some that because of just where we are in society, it's maybe a light bulb moment for them that, oh, I want to do this work. And these positions are now popping up and I want to do that. So the very first question is just really like, what does it take to be successful as a D&I practitioner? Like what skills should I enter the work with, or what skills should I be working to improve upon as I do this work? So what makes us successful in what we do?
I can start. So I think, really for DEI work is hard work because you are really trying to drive behavior change. That's the biggest the biggest challenge for the work that we do. It is people-focused work, but it is work focused on changing individual behaviors. Yes, there's work that needs to be done from an institutional perspective, so looking at policies, procedures, and making sure that we're applying sort of an equity or fairness lens to all that we do. But a lot of the work that we do is meeting people where they are individually. Mm-hmm. And so I think successful DEI practitioners and enthusiasts, as Dave says, it's really like you are passionate about this work, but you're able to tie your passion to the business side of the work. And so really being able to connect the dots on how diversity, equity, and inclusion drives better business results. So you need to be a strategic thinker. You need to have patience to meet people where they are and go on the journey with them. Also, I think you really need to be able to lead with influence and not authority. So you can't make people do anything when it comes to driving behavior change. You can tell them and set expectations, but you can't necessarily force them to do anything. So really people who are skilled in the areas of communication, like interpersonal communication, again, patience, the ability to lead with influence and not authority. And also someone who's able to see, really see goals differently. It's not as easy as just identifying metrics and seeing those metrics go up. You have to see the progress in other areas of the business.
Great. So I'll add to that. I smiled when you mentioned patience, Dee, because it was one of the first things I jotted down as I was preparing for the panel, because you absolutely need to have it. And then also it helps with being very strategic and when to launch certain things, right? Like sometimes you may think about something and be quick to implement, but taking a step back and assessing, okay, is this the right time? I think also successful practitioners are positive disruptors. Those individuals that are going to come and shake things up a little bit and create a little bit of discomfort, because that's good. Discomfort, that's where we grow.
Right.
Also being a good collaborator. Oftentimes practitioners are members of teams of one. So, how do you get work done in partnerships with other people and not necessarily feeling the burden of having to execute and implement on your own? Also individuals who are, change catalysts that will really come and think differently, think creatively, be innovative in how they're approaching their work. Also resiliency. Sometimes it's a marathon, like being for the long run, and avoid sprinting as much as you possibly can.
Love it. And I think, one of the questions in the chat that just popped up was around certifications. And sometimes when we look at practitioners, right? So what I will add and answer your question by way of as well is definitely most of the people that have gotten into this work is because they were passionate about it. And someone's in the organization, if it was an internal hire, sorry, you're passionate about it, you did some work, they're like, oh, we'll get you to do it. And then they put you over here and you have to figure out what the do it is, right? And so then now you need patience and how to influence and do all of that. Others, well, this sounds interesting. They may have gotten into it, but then they were so passionate about what their viewpoint was that they don't really have the scope and understanding of all that diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And so I do say that there are certifications, there are programs that exist in the space if you need to build up your knowledge base, your foundational knowledge, particularly if it's new to you. And if you don't have some of that other perspective of organizational change and leading with influence. A lot of the certification programs, because they know individuals are coming from all different areas, are then focused on some topics around that to at least try to give you a crash course in ones. So obviously the diversity movement's here. So I'm going to tell you about our certification. We are a provider of the Institute for Diversity certification through IDC. And so our website, which I see Kayla's on it, she She's put some links in the chat. Please look at those. They have certifications throughout the country, obviously, and a lot of them are virtual right now, so you have that option. I will not again say that there aren't other certifications that exist. Cornell, Georgetown, some of those have programs. It really will depend upon how much time you have, how much money you want to spend, and a true reflection and self-reflection of where you are, right? I did go after certification, but that was after I had been doing the work. I'd been, for years. So I was doing the certification to see what else is there in the space, to learn from others. And so I wanted to pick a program where I thought that I would actually learn more from the people in the class, because they were in the spaces that I maybe wanted to get into. Where someone else, if you're just starting, you may want to pick a program whose coursework is very foundational. That way that you can get the knowledge that you need.
I'll just add here with respect to certifications and the business that you're in. So if you are an individual who's looking to make a transition from one line of work to another, and you are interested in pursuing DEI as a profession, I think pursuing certification, just like people go back to get their MBA, I think that's a great way to pivot. I think also, if you are part of an organization that has just dropped the DEI work on your lap because you've shown interest, I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask the company to pay for you to get some training and certification in this area. And the reason it's important, it really legitimizes you as a practitioner. And so you go from being just someone who's doing the work off the side of their desk and Googling things to figure out like what might work within our organization, to really being able to address the challenges that are specific to your company, your firm, or your agency in a very strategic way. What we see a lot of from last year to this year is a lot of companies have shown a lot of demonstrated interest in this through their marketing, messages and things along the lines of, what could be conceived as performative. But really, if they're serious about doing the work, they'll invest in some resources. And to your point, there's a broad range of programs and certifications available, but they'll invest some money in upskilling the person who's going to lead this initiative, so that you're set up for success and not set up to just figure out like what is possible. There are lots of different ways to tackle this beast, but we want to get you the resources that'll make you successful.
Absolutely. And I think because we've used passionate so much, someone says, well, how do you determine if you are passionate about doing the work rather than just being passionate about the need for diversity and inclusion? So anyone want to tackle that? How have you made the distinction between I'm passionate about it, but this work is work, as we said, hard work. How do you get passionate about the work?
Dave, I'll let you go first.
Did you say me go first? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the first way that you will be able to figure that out is if you're thinking about all these opportunities and you're just generating ideas and looking at what things could look like, who can you partner with, that you are passionate about the work and that you're ready to tackle the work. And sometimes that's a little bit of a journey for all of us practitioners. Like there are times that you're like, okay, so do I really want to show up at work today? But again, it's just like, what if you have that fire and that passion in you to move to execution versus, I believe that this is important, and then versus, like this is important and here's how we can tackle this and here's how we're going to make this successful. That I think that's the main difference that I would offer, that would answer that question for okay, I'm trying to actually read through the chat.
I know.
Kathy. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
Yeah. So I'll add to that and really sort of underscore what he said is, I really think that's it. When you are moved to strategy and execution and implementation, as opposed to just saying, oh man, we got to do something about this. Like we all believe that we have to do something. I think when you're passionate about DEI work, your brain just runs in circles about what we could actually do. And when those ideas are tied and rooted in the business, I think that's where you have the best match. I think there are a lot of people who are passionate about DEI and seeing change. And to be frank, their ideas around disruption, to Dave's point, there's positive disruption, and then there's, to me, unreasonable disruption that won't work within the constructs of certain businesses. And so I think if you are passionate about the idea of DEI and you're patient enough to be able to work through the changes that are necessary, because DEI work is change management. And we talked about it on the individual behavior change and then also from an organizational perspective. And so if your brain can wrap around, developing program strategy and programs and things of that nature to really drive change, I think you're passionate about the work. Otherwise, I think if you're just passionate about DEI, there's also a place for you in this work. And that could be, leading an affinity group or business resource group. It could be, volunteering with a number of organizations to drive change, social change. So I think that would be the difference for me. But I would tell anybody, don't let someone just capitalize on your passion at work. Your passion needs to be tied to strategy, and you need to be upskilled and given the tools to be successful.
Absolutely. I love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. So with that, let's just take the perspective, since we're kind of here, right? I'm passionate. I've been tagged. I've been voluntold. I think it's a great opportunity. I've changed fields, and now I'm at work. Where do I even start? Like what things and almost same those skills that I would have brought in, how do I apply those to start creating what I need to make a strategy, right? So what are some of the first steps? I'm a year into the job, months into the jobs. What are some of the first things that I know, Dave, you're going through it. You just said you kind of switched over. What are you doing to try to build this strategy that will be to come?
The first thing that you do is just assess the current state of your business, right? So that you can determine what are the needs that will inform then your strategy. And there are many tools out there that you can use to make organizational assessments that will help you prioritize that work, so that then you can build your strategy, but most importantly, define clearly and upfront what DEI is going to deliver for the organization and what it's not. And then from there, you can continue to iterate and add programs that will continue to support the evolution of the work. But I think the most important thing from the get-go is making an assessment of the current state of your organization. What does that culture look like? Because a lot of the programs and initiatives that you are going to implement as a practitioner, in my experience, if they are not aligned to the culture of the organization, is going to be very difficult for you to be successful. So
No, I think that's an excellent point. I know I was on a conversation with a young lady that we had worked in a previous job together, and she just got hired at an association. They created this position, and I had a touch point with her a couple of days ago, and she's like, I am overwhelmed, right? She just started. But the overwhelming piece was that obviously, typically by the time an organization, sometimes that they've made the push to hire someone, they have all this stuff they think this person's going to do for them. So of course, like the first, you come on, they're like, here's the stuff. And I was like, you have to be able and willing to be like, wait, right? Despite it might be a good idea, despite it may be a good program, despite, to your point, Dee, we read somebody else is doing this. Is this really what we need to do?
Yeah. So I would say that, so there are two things. So I think the first thing that you need to do is to come in and listen and develop relationships, because you're right, there is this tendency to so almost the digital or virtual equipment in these days of someone new joining, and then there's a stack of file folders and someone hands it to you and says, hey, go through the files. That's what it can feel like when you're joining a new organization, and that's what it can feel like when you're bringing DEI function to a company that hasn't had one, or you're building something from scratch, or when you're inheriting a mess that someone else said, you know what, I throw my hands up. It can feel that way. But really, again, trying to drive individual behavior change is all about, again, leading with influence. And so you can't come in heavy-handed and say, we're going to do this, because to Dave's point, you don't know about the organization. So you come in and listen and observe and really get a pulse on what the existing culture is like, because you're going to do that cultural transformation as part of your DEI work. And so you want to know where you're starting. And so, yes, you want to listen, you want to, to your boss, your new boss, you want to make sure you're vocal about the need to ease your way into strategy development. And so really buy yourself some time to just listen, meet key stakeholders, ask your boss, whoever that person is, who do I need to meet? And that's not just going to be DEI champions. That's going to be some folks who don't believe. So you want to make sure that you're meeting the key stakeholders early in your tenure, so that, again, that you're positioned for success. So I think also as part of the organizational assessment, you're looking at culture, you're looking at the existing programs that have been in place, talking to folks at all levels of the organization. So those are the things that you're going to want to do as you're getting, understanding what the landscape looks like, so that when you pull your strategy together, you don't just drop it on people and they're like, wait, who are you and where did you come from? And how are you trying to tell me what to do? And you don't even know me, right? So those are the things that I think you want to do as you're starting to build relationships as part of a new role in a new organization or an existing organization.
I'm going to stay right there because you said a great thing. The naysayers.
Yes.
So, along the way, despite that we think maybe everyone's going to think this is the right thing to do.
No, absolutely not.
No. So what do we do? How do we engage naysayers? Do we ignore them? Do we engage them? What do we do? Help us.
I mean, I'll defer to you, Dave, first, and then I can follow up.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my experience, people react. People have a reaction when you lead with what's in it for you. Why should you even care about this, right? Because whether you believe or not that this is not for you, guess what? Yeah, this involves you. So let's step out of denial. And there are two types of naysayers in my experience. Those that are intimidated by the work because they have either zero or very low DEI competence. They don't understand the work, so they don't want to engage it. And then there's maybe the 2% that they just don't care. And I'm like, you know what, that's fine. Part of diversity is the fact that people think differently, and I'm going to honor that. However, you shouldn't be a detractor or try to sabotage the work, right? So be clear on that. And then there's what to some other people sometimes it's a bit extreme, is that if you're part of that 2% that it just doesn't really care, is not going to support it, then that goes to a different conversation as to whether or not this is the right place of employment for you. Because if our culture is attesting that this is what we believe, this is what we prioritize, and you're not really interested in supporting it, then we need to find you somewhere else to go that you may be more successful.
Right. Yeah. So I think those are all very good points. And no, we can't ignore those who don't believe, right? Because again, we're trying to move the entire organization forward. So I think, we all talk about about diversity, equity, and inclusion really being a journey, more marathon than sprint. And so we have to acknowledge and really respect in the beginning where everyone is in their journey. Some people are far along. Some people are, at the beginning of their journey. I think it's also important to understand that through the dimensions of diversity, people have grown up with different social norms. If we just take the conversation about race, there are a lot of people who grew up thinking that we don't need to talk about race. And then over the summer with the social justice issues that followed George Floyd's killing, you know, we're talking about race at work, and some people are like, no, like this, I was taught to not do this. And so overnight, we really changed how we were doing things, but we didn't necessarily give people the tools to be able to engage in that dialogue. So I think you can't ignore people. I do think that you give people the benefit of the doubt in the beginning, unless they're being jerks, right? Some people are just jerks and want to do things intentionally that are offensive. But you have to bring people along on a journey where you're both providing education and awareness around some of these topics and providing them an opportunity to be curious. So I don't think we ignore them. I also don't think that we force engagement. You know, I think we provide resources to people and let them participate on their own timeline, so long as they are taking steps forward on their journey.
Absolutely.
That's a good point that you're making, because the analogy that I had heard from one of my coworkers while I was at Blue, specific to preparing people to engage in conversations about race at work, was that we need to go ahead and give people that life vest and the floaters before we push them out at the deep end of the pool.
Absolutely, yes.
Then we're going to have issues, right? And people are going to feel forced to engage in conversations that, because of where they are in their individual journey, they may not be ready to engage.
Right, absolutely.
That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested or supportive. Is that they may be trying to process what that is for them before they can engage someone else in a certain topic. So that's spot on, and I completely agree.
Yeah, and I think you will learn, you get to know the naysayers back to the assessment, right? So whether you are doing listening sessions, whether you hire a consultant to do listening sessions, whether you take a survey, right? Through that kind of qualitative, quantitative piece, you get to understand, to David's point, what type of naysayers you really have. And naysayers versus, to his point, people that are going to try to sabotage, that's a different story. Right? That's not, to me, like, because people are like, why would you spend time with them? Like, we're not talking about straight sabotage. Like, that's to Dave's point, we need to talk to HR. You got to find somewhere else. We will happily write you a recommendation. But the naysayers really are people that just may not understand, why are we doing this? Why, to the point someone just put, you put a statement out, now here we go, right? Because they just feel they may not have the true picture and purpose and where we're really trying to do. And to Dave's point, how does it include them? Most of the time when I come in and we have listening sessions, and I even one-on-one with some of the C-suite things, they're like, well, I would love to talk about it at work, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. Like, I don't know, am I supposed to say Black? Am I supposed to say African-American? Am I supposed to say queer? Am I like you can, I mean, they're really like nervous because right now we're inside, because then if I say the wrong thing, they may post about me on social media. Like, there's all of this. So it's not that I'm saying nay, really, I'm just saying nay because I'm not ready.
Right. And so that's where I think the really important piece, and this is where companies come in, and this is just this is a seismic shift for a lot of companies to really be embracing these conversations. But again, rooting, and I think this was someone talking about, you know, understanding the company's DEI strategy. And this is why you root your strategy in business results. Yeah. The reason we are doing all of this is because we want to have better business performance. Companies that have more diversity have better business results. That's just table stakes. And so we can look at our organization today and say that there are opportunities for improvement across a number of dimensions of diversity. And the reason we are equipping our employees to, you know, lead with empathy or, you know, have a conversation around what inclusion really looks like is because you can't go out and hire a whole bunch of diversity and expect them to stay in an environment that isn't inclusive. So we're focused on readying the ground for inclusion. And that's what this looks like. And so that's why your strategy cannot just be feel good. Yeah, this is the right thing to do. And we're taking a stance on social justice issues. Like, you're not doing that just because of the company's moral compass, if you will. You are doing it because that compass is steering you in the direction of better business results and meeting market expectations. So that's why it's important for DEI folks to not just be driven by passion, because passion will tell you, oh yeah, it feels good when everybody gets along. No, when people don't get along, they're not spending time thinking about work. And when they're not spending time thinking about work, we're losing money. So that's really how you have to talk to C-suite folks about why DEI matters. yes, you have metrics and goals around representation. But again, it isn't just about plucking diverse folks from different groups and dropping them in, because then you're going to have an attrition problem, and that costs money. So again, we have to think about, just like any other function within an organization, you have to think about your DEI strategy and tie it to business objectives. So the reason we're trying to point to these naysayers and bring them along is because, the naysayers in middle management, they are giving people from diverse backgrounds different types of review comments. How does that show up? People leave because they don't get promoted. And what does that do? Cost us money. So again, I know I'm being redundant in this, but you have to tie it and root it and speak in a language that isn't just that softer side of business that senior leaders will often try to say, oh, well, we don't have time to focus on that.
Absolutely.
Feel good stuff.
Yeah, the feel good stuff. And it's not that, right? Because you're absolutely right. And so that's where as well, it's important for you that if you don't have the understanding and the research around what is the business case, that you have to spend time doing that, right? There are articles, you bring those, you're ready. The McKinsey and company reports, the Deloitte reports, there's so much to our when I first started this D&I work that wasn't there, that is now there, that if you do a search around business case, right, you have the studies to prove, millennials are picking companies related to what their D&I brand is. So if you're saying, I want to go out here and get, individuals, well, in the interview, they might ask you, what are we doing around diversity and inclusion? And you better have an answer besides, we posted a statement about the killing of George Floyd. That's not what they're talking about. So what else are you doing? So that's going to impact talent. Same to your point. We know there's research and the percentages around innovation and a percentage that it makes us smarter. And the more that you have diversity of thought in the room, there's disruption of just status quo. Like there's so much data that you can use, and you want to use that around the business case to continue to speak their language. It's called managing up, right? I can't just come in and say what I think is going to sell it. You know what your C-suite is looking for. How does this impact us? Is it going to cost us? What can it cost us? And the ultimate return on investment. You got to speak that language, and thus taking the courses if necessary, and or looking up information and seeking out assistance to have that speech is going to be so important for you as a practitioner on the ground.
Something that I want to add to the example that Dee provided around representation, and then a focus on bringing people in, but then you may not necessarily be bringing them into the right environment for them, and then they're going to leave. So that creates attrition. Something that's important for practitioners to keep an eye on is how the life cycle of the employee, from when you're sourcing to when you're evaluating, like, who do you want to bring in, like, then you bring people in, but then, like, how do people move across the organization, right? So looking at things like mobility, looking at their engagement, trust. If certain demographics are leaving at a higher rate, like, well, let's figure out what that is. Because again, and to this point, all of this translates into money. Replacing talent, like finding talent costs money, replacing talent costs money, addressing issues that may be rooted in diversity deficiencies costs money. And all of that impacts the bottom line, like Dee said. I think that sometimes we look at these in silos. So it's like, oh yeah, we need to hire more Hispanics, and we need to promote more, women. Like, do you need to figure out what your ecosystem is? Like, what do you want that to be? And then what are the practices and behaviors that you need to have present in order for that to work?
Right.
Absolutely. And that's why saying that assessment piece is so important, and not just the typical assessment. So even as we go into 2021, and I'll ask you, a question around that, but share some insight, right? Like, what else should we be looking at? So typically, yes, most organizations, when they first start, they're like, oh, we'll just count heads and count seats. That's just one piece of data that you would want to look at. But you also want to look at your policies. You also want to look at your procedures. You also wanted to Dee's point, look at manager if there is an opportunity for 360 feedback. Do we have a frozen middle, a frozen group of managers that it's just not working? Everybody that we send there that may be from a diverse background, it just falls out. Well, why is that, right? What other things that we can look at? For instance, now, maybe even because we're virtual, who's slacking who's talking, right? You could be pulling that data, right? Who gets invited to what meetings? You can look at calendar invites, like who's a part of the decision conversation. When we really say, oh, we're diverse, everybody has a seat at the table. Nuh-uh, not everybody gets invited to that meeting. So who gets invited to the meeting? Those are things and different pieces of the organization and data that as a diversity practitioner, you want to look at and have access to. So with that, my question would be, in a way, one, in 2021, what other things should people be looking at or data points, but even more the collaboration. So you kind of talked about it, Dave, like what, you can't just be the D&I group, right? So in your work, both of you as practitioners, what other individuals or bits of the organization do you have to reach out to really make this work, where you can't just come in, I'm the chief diversity officer, but you really are building this collaboration? So across, what other teams are you working with and pulling into this work?
Yeah, so in our in our organization and then others, it's really important to have a strong line into senior leadership and not just the C level, right? So it's who are the key influencers, and depending on the size of the organization that you're part of, this could vary. Who do early career professionals or people at lower levels of the organization, who do they see as the boss, right? Who do they think of as the big boss? And, having relationships with those folks and helping them understand that the behaviors that they display as leaders really kind of have effects on, trickle down effects on the entire organization, even when they may not be aware. Marketing, of course, is really important to understand how we're positioning things both internally and externally. So then if marketing is separate from communications, having ties into communications as well. Operations is important too. Like, I really believe that the CDO or diversity leader needs to be plugged into every part of the business. And I think it's also important, and I didn't add this in the beginning, but successful DEI practitioners, I think, are good coaches. They serve in a sort of internal consultant role where people can reach out to them. So they're highly visible and people can reach out to them and ask questions. Sometimes diversity, equity, inclusion, or D&I, whatever it's called in your organization, is situated within HR. So you may have this brand challenge, this internal brand challenge of not being seen as HR, because sometimes people don't want to go to HR with DEI related topics or issues because they don't want to get someone in trouble, right? They just want to talk about it. So really, I think the DEI officer being plugged in to senior leaders and folks from across the organization, I think that helps to have a separate sort of brand persona internally, that's different from HR. Like, I'm not a punitive function within our company. If I hear something that rises to the level of HR escalation, I'll point people in that direction, but I'm not the one issuing write-ups, right? So I want people to come to me. I also think it's important for the chief diversity officer or diversity leader to be plugged in at all levels of the organization. You got to keep your ear to the street, because sometimes stuff that happens in the org chart, further down in the org chart, never makes its way up to senior management, but it's festering. So you need to be, no matter what your title is, you need to be like part of all the conversation circles.
Yeah. And that's to add to that, that's a benefit of having ERGs.
Mm-hmm.
And you will find out that information at the baseline level, right? Because these communities are gonna come together, they're gonna start networking, and then you're gonna start hearing themes. It's like, oh well, and so it's also great to be plugged in with them. The other couple of partnerships that I valued a lot while I was at Blue. So our internal communications team to help you tell your story, highlight stories, the marketing team, making sure that your look and feel and your messaging and how you're coming across different populations, both internally and externally, is that your message is on point. But then also the culture and change team was the other partnership that was very important and critical for me, because so they're the ones that are launching our employee trust survey, and we built an inclusion index within that survey, and we got some data that we could track over a year that highlighted, I'm like, oh wow, like these are in the lower percentiles, like we need to go ahead and start doing things to change that. Because again, I think that's the reason why sometimes practitioners get a little bit overwhelmed, and then like you lose your fuel, you lose your passion, is that it becomes extremely overwhelming when you're trying to tackle so many things, but you're a member of a team of 1 or a team of 2 or even 3, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it helps you stay definitely focused, and absolutely. We used to say, you know, back in the day, like the person you need to be just as kind to, because you should be kind to everyone, but really, right, it was like the secretary and the custodian, right? That's like the ear on the street, right? Now we're not necessarily in the office for that, but it's very similar, right? Those are the people that when we launch something, they're hearing like, oh, here we go again, and they can be like, Dee, they're not really feeling this, right? Or this is the response. So you have to be able to, yes, definitely amongst different parts in the organization, but then the same, who's going to help you do the work? Everybody. Right? 'Cause I can go to the meeting and we can talk all day to the C-suite, but the person that's really got to set up the dashboard, that's who I need to talk to, right? And I need to be that person. And you should exhibit that as well as a D&I professional, because you are trying to get everyone in the organization to understand how we are better together collectively. And the better that we can collaborate and build things internally as a collaboration, the better we will be, right? And that is key, that you exhibit that. Right. You can't be the D&I officer and the person that nobody wants to talk to.
Absolutely. Yes. So being approachable is, you know, one of the big things. And to your point, Florence, about who's going to do the work, you know, in all the conversations that I have about DEI, I make sure everyone understands that this is work that we all have to participate in. There's a role that we all play in this. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a sentiment that the responsibility for executing a DEI strategy falls on senior leadership. And I'll be quick to tell someone, like, look, if C-suite executives had all the answers, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I think that, you know, just really ingraining in everyone that this is work that we all need to do on a regular and consistent basis. And that when we launch things and that we roll them out, you know, part of being plugged in to different parts of the organization from a you know, function perspective and then sort of a role perspective is to make sure that what we're building works for as many people as possible. So, you know, as we think about, you know, as you think about your, you know, employee population, when can we schedule events? You know, do we communicate, you know, by Microsoft Teams, or do we communicate by email? Like making sure that you're taking the extra steps to be sure that people are receiving the information in a way that's easily digestible for them. You know, are we sending 40-page white papers around, or are we taking the time to, you know, create these chunk-sized nuggets so people can get the learning and then move on to the next thing? I saw a question in the chat about whether or not it would be beneficial for the EEO coordinator to be a good person to also be the diversity and inclusion representative. I think it depends on if that EEO coordinator or EEO officer, if that's their only role, or if their role is something else situated in HR. And the reason you'll hear me talk a lot about the distinction between, in my world, the distinction between HR and DEI is I think they're two totally different mindsets, right? So as much as we're all working to make sure that the company is in a good space, DEI, almost like employee engagement and folks who focus on culture, their focus is on the employee experience, the candidate experience, the, you know, how we're engaging with the community. What does that feel like And as outcomes of that work, we're driving better business results. Sometimes, not always, HR has a different perspective. And so I think it depends on, in your organization, if your HR function is more personnel and employee relations, I do not think DEI needs to be situated there. If your HR function is more people services, employee engagement, I think that's a great place for DEI to sit. So I think it just depends on your organization, because the last thing you want to do is have diversity, equity, and inclusion if you're introducing that function to your company or firm. You don't want it to be positioned as a compliance function, because then you lose a lot of trust, which is what I see happening in the chat. You lose a lot of trust within the organization, and people feel like, oh, we're just doing this to check a box, and you're doing so much more than that.
Absolutely agree.
Absolutely. And I sometimes with organizations that are just starting out and they're like, well, where should we sit this individual? Or they're not even having that conversation. And I tell them that's just as important as just posting the position. Like,
right.
Where will they sit? Who do they report to? Who do they have access to on a daily basis, a monthly basis? All of that is so important. And that's, again, building part of that trust. In the last few moments we have together, I want to focus on a couple of things, and then I'll try to summarize some of the other discussion that I see towards the end. One is 2021. We all thought, whoo, now 2020 is over. We're going to ride this thing. It's going to be a breeze, 2021. And I think the meme I saw was like 7 days in, I want my money back, right? The trial is over. I want my money back. So what are we going to see? We can't predict. We surely couldn't predict all we saw in 2020. But how is that going to ripple into 2021? Even as of last week, what we saw, like as practitioners, how do we plan? What are going to be the trends? What should we at least try to focus on? Help us again, Dave. You kind of talked about how we can't be everything to everyone, but at least what are some of the things that may pop up in 2021 industry trends that we should be aware of?
You know, one of the things that I saw in 2020 that, you know, continues to be true in 2021 is, again, that focus on equity, but not only racial equity, just equity in general, like pay equity. So that I think that will continue. Companies will continue to focus on that. The conversation about, you know, race and racial relationships in the workplace will continue to happen. And Dee talked about this earlier. There's a boom in demand for DEI jobs. Like many organizations that did not have a function are now hiring for a function. And I think that also something that was good that came out of 2020 was the fact that you know, either organizations or individuals that might have not been vocal about issues around diversity or opportunities around diversity are coming out with bold behaviors to engage in conversation and partner with others to develop solutions. So I think that that will continue to happen in 2021. And how do you remove the taboos about, like, oh, you don't talk about religion at work, you don't talk about race at work, you don't talk about X at work. It's just like, you know what, guess what? Like, we do. But you need to do that in a way that, like, we need to prepare the workforce to engage in meaningful conversations around these topics, so that you do not create you know, unnecessary disruption or have things blow up in your face, because then that's going to be double work for you. So those are some of the things that I have observed that will more than likely continue in 2021. Yeah.
I think those are all good. I will bold, underline, all caps the equity piece. So I think, you know, a lot of folks have a challenge understanding equity as a construct within diversity and inclusion work. And so I think some organizations and some practitioners and thought leaders in this space are starting to talk about fairness, because I think fairness is easier for people to understand. So as we apply that fairness lens on, you know, the policies, procedures, and programs within our organization, across all the different things that we talked about today, the different metrics and things that we can kind of assess, are we doing things in a fair way? And if the answer is no, and if the answer is no by some sort of slice of demographics, then what can we do to ensure fairness and to restore fairness in those spaces? And so I think a lot of companies, spent 2020 saying, man, we have to do something, right? So that was issuing the statements. It was figuring out do we start a DEI function? Do we not? And so I think what we'll see in 2021 is really sort of this assessment of what's happening. I think there will continue to be turnover in DEI roles because I think some organizations, talk a good talk, but when it comes to, the rubber meeting the road, they're not ready to actually do the work and people will move on. I think also, to your point, educate. Well, I think we'll see more education and awareness building on like what these things actually look like in practice. And so we've got high level talking points. We've got some social challenges that are bringing these things to the workplace. We have, people, we're in the middle of a pandemic, people are working virtually. There's constant news cycle. There's just people are overwhelmed and can't escape. And so I think it bodes well for us from a mental health perspective, and then also from a DEI perspective to upskill employees on how to have these conversations. Again, not bombarding people with calendar requests to come talk about their feelings, but also not having managers on calls acting like these things aren't going on in the world, right? So there's some happy medium there, which I think is really about how do you lead with empathy. So those are the things that I think will be, we'll see more of in 2021. I think the conversation and challenges that we have around representation with respect to race, I think those are going to continue, but I do think we'll see progress.
Love it. The last moments that I'm going to ask, because I'm going to ask you too, and you kind of just mentioned it, right? The well-being, and specifically for DEI practitioners. Right. I mean, we are, again, we try, whether we don't want to say we want to be all things, all people, but we sometimes end up being that. Right. Once somebody in this same, I found in 2020, as soon as someone knew that's the work I do, it's like, oh, well, can you come talk about it? What can you? And because, again, we want to see progress, we could be yes people all day long. Right. But at the end of the day, Dee, what a very first point was what? This is hard work. Mm-hmm. So how do you as practitioners self-care? How are you prioritizing self-care? How do you maybe not read the news? Like what are you doing to your point, Dave, wake up the next morning and like, yeah, I still want to do this. I still want to go to work. So what are you doing?
Do you want to go, Dee?
Sure. I celebrate all my wins. And so those wins in DEI work could be someone who never said a word in any of my sessions, sending me an email on Saturday morning saying that, hey, Dee, here's an article from the Wall Street Journal, and it being about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that's a win for me, right? When people who didn't want to participate, I didn't think they were listening, when they send me something to say, hey, Dee, I hear you, I'm paying attention to that, that's a win. I also have a strong network of DEI practitioners that I stay connected with, and we talk about the challenges. And sometimes you just need someone you could call and say, you are not going to believe this, because, some of the stuff we hear and some of the stuff we see, like only someone who does this work will appreciate how ridiculous it is. Mm-hmm. I think therapy is really important also for DEI practitioners. Last year was very hard. I said this on a panel I was part of last year. You are a quasi-therapist at work. When you open the door to have conversations about race, everybody comes to you with their stories, like everybody. And then the people who don't have those stories come and say, like, I don't want to be a bigot. What do I do? That's heavy work, right? And to make sure that everyone is considered all the time can be taxing. So I think therapy, a great network of people to rely on and kind of share funny stories, and then celebrating your wins, I think is important. And use your PTO, right? I say this all the time. You cannot boil the ocean. There will always be more work to do than we have time. So use your PTO, take a break, right? You're not being disloyal. You really are changing your scenery so that you can get a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So the only other thing that I would add to that is just like check in with yourself constantly and like acknowledge where what your feelings are. So then you can have, your coaching session with whomever your go-to person is, right? It's like, you know what, I'm struggling with this and help me out. I think that that's important. And again, understanding that you're never going to be all things to all people. And then also do not take on the, don't feel like just because you are the practitioner, you need to always have the answers to everything, right? Those are some of the things that I would also add to this. Just make sure that you're leaning into others for support. And again, that you're taking care of yourself, that you're checking in with yourself so that you can continue to have enough energy to continue on with the work. I think you're on mute, Florence.
I know, look at that. That was the first time today that someone gets to say that's also the meme of 2020, right? You're on mute.
Right.
But that we're at 11:58 and we don't have enough time. I always told you, I still had like a whole nother sheet of questions and some in the chat too. What I want, I think the biggest point to take away for today is we need more of these conversations. Just to Dee's point, we need, as individuals, to create places where we can constantly ask the questions. Because it as well helps us know that sometimes, again, to your point, Dave, you may be the only person doing DEI work at your job, and you do feel like I'm not getting anywhere, and then it sometimes takes the other person's story, and you're like, oh well, we're not as bad as I thought we were, right? So that you can celebrate your wins. So some ways that we can do that in the interim, we do have a portal that we have as a beta test that we can send out information around, and you can log in, where it's a place for you to ask questions, to post resources that we're finding. We as the diversity movement post resources there that you will have access to, so that way we can build a community where we can continue to keep each other's lifted, and as well provide the resources we may need no matter where your organization is in the journey. You, as well as been said before, this we will get the this is being recorded, and so we will share the recording, share it with someone else that maybe couldn't come from your team, or someone else that you know that is doing this work, so again that they too can learn. And lastly, I know in the chat there were a lot of more specific questions about, well, what survey could you use, and is there a copy, and all of that. And I'm not trying to sell us, but the diversity movement, you can ask us questions. We're still available to ask questions and to have initial conversation and share some things with you. So please continue to look into us and what we do. And we partner with these two individuals, and so we can help you get connected to them and share. Because what I do know about this diversity, equity, and inclusion community overall is we do want people to be successful, because how others are successful and you have leading practices, it can help us with our work. And we are overall passionate about really trying to make this world better, so that our workplaces reflect what we want to also see happening in our society, and what the whole premise of this is. So thank you for attending. Look forward to the recording, the other ways that you can learn about us, and the services and things that we add. Thank you, Dee and Dave. I'll call you the dynamic Ds, the dynamic Ds. I appreciated you. I learned something. I'm energized to continue the rest of the work for the day. And so thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care of yourselves. Have a good one. Bye-bye.